Dear listener, Hevert-Arzneimittel proudly presents the audiobook Samuel Hahnemann, The Beautiful Dancer and the Bandit King by Peter Eckhart-Reichel, narrated by Simon Veridan. With this audiobook, we invite you on an acoustic journey to the dawn of the 19th century, the Age of Enlightenment, a period of great social change and the French Revolutionary Wars. It is also a journey to the beginnings of homeopathy and the restless, nomadic years of its founder, Christian Friedrich Samuel Hahnemann. I hope you find it both interesting and entertaining. Sincerely yours, Matthias Hevert.
Samuel Hahnemann, The Beautiful Dancer and the Bandit King. Samuel Hahnemann had just recently settled in Mölln, a backwater town that was located in the southwest of Schleswig-Holstein and had a population of just 1,000 souls at the time. In any case, he and his family didn't have the spare time to enjoy the scenic countryside or local sights in the electorate of Hanover, as their living situation, from a financial perspective, had not developed in the manner that he had hoped when they first arrived in the provincial town. Hahnemann had actually wanted to dedicate himself further to developing his new medical theory here, and aspired more to working as a medical writer than as a physician. But everything turned out, as it so often happens, completely differently. He was sitting in his study in the lovely half-timbered house of the old pharmacy in the Marktstrasse and sifting through a big stack of papers containing a variety of correspondence. Letters from grateful patients that he had once helped recover from various illnesses, letters from younger colleagues seeking medical counsel, and offers from publishers who were calling for his latest medical insights. Apart from these, there were paid as well as unpaid bills that needed attending to. He gathered all of the papers together into a bundle, put them in a drawer of his secretary, and locked it. Samuel Hahnemann furrowed his somewhat prominent brow, then heard the footsteps of his wife Henriette, who was just climbing the wooden staircase to his study. The old wooden door creaked as she opened it. The next moment she was standing beside him, quietly saying, "Samuel, you can't stay up at your desk every night and work until daybreak. Think of your own health for once, and not only about that of your fellow human beings. Why don't you finally come to bed? I have brought you a glass of warm cow's milk." Samuel took the glass of milk from her hand, placed it carefully to one side, and looked at her tenderly. Then he cautiously pressed his ear to her pregnant belly and listened deeply. The world appeared to be utterly still for some seconds. Then they both heard a faint sound from the next room where their children were sleeping peacefully. Henriette lit one of the candles on Samuel's secretary and slipped quietly into the bedchamber to look in on the children. Samuel gently whispered to her, retreating back, "I'll be along soon. I only want to write this one letter." Then he picked up his quill, placed a fresh sheet of paper on the table, and began to write. Mölln, August 1st, 1800. My dearest friend, I have come to know many different kinds of migraine since we last parted company. The only thing that is important is that I know exactly which type yours is, in order to eliminate it completely, including the roots. I must know how it, if no medication is being employed, begins, how it progresses, and how it ends. Only then can I be of any assistance to you from here. Please let me know on which occasions it always occurs. Which precursors are there in advance? Do they begin early when you wake? Does the pain spread throughout the head, or is it only in the back or at the sides of your head, just above your eyes, at the temples, and so forth? Also, whether the outer skin on your head feels painful when touched. And now for the most essential thing, what type of pain? Does it feel as if it is pressing, cutting, pulling, piercing, burrowing, as if from remorse or frustration? Is it a pulsing pain, or just a dull pain, or more like a downward pressure as if caused by a weight? If you follow the above guide, you should now be able to create a true picture of this monster, and I hope that I will be then able to aid you soon, and I shall be pleased to do it with all my heart. You asked about our well-being in your letter. Well then, with respect to me, thank God that I am here, where I am only obliged to earn half of what is needed in Hamburg and live more comfortably. Mölln is a small town consisting of about 230 houses, filled with all types of inexpensive craftsmen and equipped with the required necessities. For that reason, it is not easy for an impoverished, autonomous intellectual like old Hahnemann to feed himself and his soon-to-be expanded family. On the other hand, his keen ambition, which keeps driving him to conduct various experiments, is one of his most fundamental character traits. If you, dear friend, should possibly know of someone who might require my medical assistance, please send word to me. I would be very, very grateful for any suggestions regarding a new post. P.S. Tomorrow I am setting out on a long journey to distant Saarbrücken. I expect a great deal from it, but I will tell you about it in more detail another time. Your old friend, Samuel Hahnemann. Due to his precarious economic situation, he had written a number of similar letters to friends and colleagues all over Germany in the previous weeks. Every single one with the mute hope that the recipients would give him tips or advice on where he might be able to find a secure livelihood as a physician, chemist, translator, or scientist. More than anything else, though, Samuel Hahnemann's greatest wish was to be able to dedicate himself to his medical research without any distractions. In fact, just a few days earlier, he had received surprising and most pleasant tidings. The promising news had come from the distant city of Saarbrücken. His former fellow student and friend, from the time they were both studying at the Friedrich-Alexander University in Erlangen, Dr. Karl Georg Friedrich, had reacted to his letter with a heartfelt invitation. Friedrich was an ardent admirer of Hahnemann's scientific research and an attentive reader of his chemical, pharmacological, and medical publications, and had written that Hahnemann should call on him in Saarbrücken as soon as he was able. Although the city had been occupied by the French revolutionary soldiers for 6 years, he had a flourishing medical practice and could not complain about a lack of patients. Hahnemann, as his old friend and fraternity brother, would be most heartily welcome at any time, and in all probability it should be possible to make arrangements for him with the French. Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who was 45 years old by then, had already made a name for himself in professional circles based on his scientific publications and research. His prior publications had always been centered on the welfare of his fellow human beings. However, the conventional medical methods still employed around 1800 were primarily restricted to bloodletting, cupping, and the use of laxatives and emetics. Hahnemann had long since recognized the absurdity, and yes, even the danger of these methods, and criticized their use publicly, which, naturally, made him the target of a great deal of covert and overt animosity. Meanwhile, not only did he harbor doubts about orthodox medicine, no, he rejected it. His views were becoming a bone of contention between his medical contemporaries. Some colleagues even attempted to overwhelm him with mockery. Thus, it was even more gratifying when more positive replies reached him before his departure for Saarbrücken. They were invitations from some very highly respected colleagues from the Private Medical Society of Mainz. The chemist and physician, Professor Nikolaus Karl Molitor, was very eager to meet him. Hahnemann was familiar with Professor Molitor's research in the field of electricity and its influence on plant growth. Dr. Jakob Fidelis Ackermann also had sent encouragement and his regards. Even Karl and Josef Wenzel, two other colleagues who had already made great strides in their studies of epilepsy, sent Hahnemann a letter requesting to meet them without fail during his visit to Mainz. Thus, Samuel Hahnemann had prepared for his departure very thoroughly and in excellent spirits. Naturally, at this point, he could not possibly have any inkling of the exciting adventures he would encounter during his long journey across Germany. His wife Henriette was fighting back the tears when she fell into his arms as he bid her goodbye. He promised that he would be back in Mölln in time for the birth of their child at the latest, and lovingly pulled her close. In the meantime, a group of boisterous children, half of whom were his own, surrounded the post-coach that was waiting at the market. Such conveyances were still cause for a minor sensation in the small Lauenburg town. Samuel Hahnemann had placed his travel bags in the coach's stowage by then, among them 2 large leather trunks full of medical books, and also his valuable collection of remedies with countless carefully labeled little bottles, precious tinctures, salves, and small boxes that all had to go with him on his long journey. Finally, the mail coach started rolling over the charming little town's rough cobblestones on the morning of August 2nd, 1800. The clamoring flock of children ran alongside it until it reached the next fork in the road. They stood there to watch until nothing more than a cloud of dust could be seen disappearing into the distance. 2 days passed. Samuel Hahnemann had had to change transport companies in Frankfurt. From there he traveled with the Imperial Reichspost, which was better known under the name of Turn- and Taxis-Post. The responsible postmaster had advised him to do so, as the coaches were larger and more comfortable and adhered exactly to their timetables. Samuel Hahnemann studied his travel route. His next stop would be Mannheim. The post-coach that departed Mannheim at 6 o'clock in the evening would already reach Saarbrücken the next day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but only for a considerable surcharge. Some of the trials and tribulations that travelers had to contend with when traveling by post-coach were caused by meteorological events, but human error was an even more frequent source. Drunkenness on the driver's box seat played a similar role in many coach accidents, just as drunkenness behind the wheel of a car does today. The travelers on the express post-coach had just such an irresponsible coachman sitting on their driver's box. He was a coarse horse flayer who reeked of spirits, one who incessantly cracked the whip and cursed all oncoming cart and wagon drivers in the most vile manner if they did not instantly make way for him. When he blew into the coach's horn, it sounded more like a rusty watering can than like the official postal horn signal required by the Turn and Taxis post regulations. He also regularly demanded payoffs from his own passengers shortly before each relay station. The claim was that the money was needed to purchase grease for the squeaking wheel bearings, but he never spent it for the stated purpose and bought spirits instead. Not only that, but soon after departing Frankfurt, it began raining in torrents, and the coach started lurching perilously from side to side. One passenger made matters worse by telling the travel party about the most terrible recent coach accidents in such a manner that an older woman came very close to fainting dead away. Dr. Hahnemann quickly came to her aid with a few drops of veratrum album, which prevented the worst from occurring. Contrary to all the fears of the passengers inside, the post-coach arrived in Mannheim punctually and completely unscathed. And at 6 o'clock in the evening of the same day, he climbed into the coach bound for Saarbrücken. When Samuel Hahnemann, as announced in his letter, went to seek out his old friend and former fellow student, Doctor of Medicine Karl Georg Friedrich, at his physician's practice in the center of Saarbrücken, he found himself standing in front of a bolted and barred door, which bore a seal and an official public notice in French and German. Effective immediately, This practice is closed by official order of the prefect and government inspector of the directorial government of the Département de la Sarre. Trier, on the 15th Thermidor of the 8th year of the French Revolution, signed Joseph Bexon Dormschwiller. At that moment, Samuel Hahnemann could have nearly used the services of a physician himself. He stood as if turned into stone in front of his friend's sealed door, and read the public notice affixed to it over and over again. How could this have happened? And what had happened at all? He was unable to come up with any explanation for this strange situation. Finally, a passerby walked up to him and asked if he perhaps wished to see Dr. Friedrich. Samuel Hahnemann could only muster a mute nod. "Then you will have to find another doctor whether you like it or not, my good man. Dr. Friedrich was apprehended by the French and led away 3 days ago." The stranger gave Hahnemann a friendly pat on the shoulder, then leaned in more closely and whispered, "You should not remain standing here too long. You will only draw the attention of the German and French spies to yourself. Dr. Friedrich sympathized with the German Jacobins too publicly, which is the reason his enemies hatched a plot against him and spread the rumor that he was involved in dubious business dealings with the enemies of the French Revolution." The stranger cautiously turned his head to the left and then to the right to see if they were being observed by anyone on the street. Then he disappeared as quickly as he had come, leaving a perplexed Samuel Hahnemann behind on the steps of his friend's house. What should be done now? Look for his friend in one of France's countless dungeons and jails? Intervene personally with the prefect and government inspector of the directorial government in Trier? The situation seemed quite hopeless, and he walked through the narrow streets of Saarbrücken, feeling helpless and dejected. Suddenly he had a brilliant idea. The doctors and professors in Mainz would surely have good advice about what to do in this case. Samuel Hahnemann immediately resolved to continue his journey to Mainz the next day. The seat of the current government of the Département Donnersberg, now called Mayence under French administration, was located there. When he arrived at the coach station the next day, the postmaster in authority there welcomed him with a surly expression on his face. But Hahnemann would not be deterred and asked about the next possible opportunity to travel in the general direction of Mainz. Whereupon the postmaster's countenance adopted an even more menacing scowl. "What are you thinking, my good fellow?" he demanded. "Our homeland is in a state of war. Laws no longer apply. There is only martial law and an arbitrary military power. The German authorities, who are actually supposed to ensure the country's security, have either fled from the French or they are powerless because of the French troops, who for their part, however, are incapable of establishing any calm and order here." Then he looked at the service schedule and tapped his index finger on a column that contained the heading "Departures," marked in red. "If we can manage to get a couple of horses and a coachman together by then, you could take that post-coach." Hahnemann studied the schedule and took a few notes. After a time, the postmaster approached him again. "Sir, you have not heard of the notorious band of robbers that has been terrorizing the countryside around here?" Samuel Hahnemann shrugged his shoulders sheepishly. He had indeed never heard anything about this band of outlaws. Instead of answering, he pointed to his bags and inquired about how much room the coach could be expected to have. The postmaster only furrowed his brow and said, "I hope you don't have anything valuable in your trunks. The number of ruffians roaming all over this region has been growing so rampantly lately that no one ventures outdoors unaccompanied even in daylight, and at night not a soul dares walk across fields anymore for fear of being maltreated or robbed." He scratched thoughtfully at his whiskers, then lowered his voice and added, "The robber band is but one of the problems. The other is the French themselves. Our animals are being confiscated from their stables almost daily, and the mail stations are forced to put up with the French and their revolution in order to regain our property. The entire populace of the towns and villages on the left side of the Rhine were suffering great hardship, also because of the many seizures by the French troops. That is why it was especially the country folk and farmers who had taken a hostile stance toward the foreign occupation forces. It is also understandable that in these lawless times, numerous bands of outlaws had formed who were not thought of as bandits at first, but more as patriots fighting for the fatherland. Stealing horses and livestock from the hated French did not count as robbery or theft at all, but rather was tacitly regarded as compensation. The most legendary among these robbers was a certain Johannes Böckler, who became known by the name of Schinderhannes. As long as he and his band of merry men only stole from the French, they were folk heroes. That changed rather quickly, though, when the citizens themselves became the victims of his raids. When stealing horses was no longer lucrative enough, Schinderhannes and his gang resorted to waylaying travelers in broad daylight. One of the most sensational deeds of this type was the attack on a post coach near Waldböckelheim at the beginning of January 1800. The postmaster was holding a wanted poster in his hand that described the ambush in precise detail and also bore a likeness of the sought-after bandit king. He handed the sheet containing the official public notice to all travelers who persisted in their intent to journey towards Mainz, because the notorious robber's preferred territory for his crimes was precisely along that route. Samuel Hahnemann studied the warrant, then handed it back to the postmaster without comment. "You should know, sir," the postmaster continued, "Waldböckelheim is located exactly on your travel route, and I am officially obliged to—" He put on his spectacles and started reading the notice, "obliged to publicly inform everyone about this robbery, especially the civil and military authorities in every town. So, in case someone should already have or gain any knowledge of this incident, and especially of the offenders, that person must convey any information and news to the local court sub oblatione ad quevis reciproca." After the postmaster had carried out his official duty, he folded the warrant and returned it to the breast pocket of his service uniform. Of course, it had not escaped him that the traveling gentleman was not about to be deterred from his intention. So he turned the corners of his mouth down so far that his spectacles slid down to the tip of his nose in the process. Then he concluded his official duty with a personal remark. "The bandit scourge has sometimes even ventured very close to the cities, sir. I would therefore urgently recommend that you accept taking a longer route, as you are so determined to travel to Mainz in any case. The short route is really very dangerous." Naturally, this conscientious man knew exactly whereof he spoke. "If I get the horses in time, the journey will begin in 1.5 hours, said the postmaster to the gentleman, so impatient to continue on his way. Meanwhile, Hahnemann was making himself comfortable on one of his large trunks. "By the way, you will have a very attractive traveling companion." The postmaster made a gesture toward the waiting room with his head, where indeed a remarkably alluring young woman was sitting. And in fact, it was very nearly a miracle that exactly 1.5 hours later, a coach and a pair of horses stood at the ready in front of the post station, while a Palatine coachman busied himself with stowing the horses' provisions and inspecting the condition of the wheel hubs. In the meantime, Samuel Hahnemann had introduced himself to the young lady in the waiting room. She was a French dancer named Cécile Vestry, who had been especially engaged to perform at the Mainz Theatre for a guest appearance by the prefect of the department Donnersberg. She had briefly interrupted her travels in Saarbrücken on her way from Paris, and now intended to carry on with the final portion of her long journey. Accompanying her was a stout chambermaid, who was perspiring and puffing as a result of her struggle with the countless number of bags the dancer had brought with her, which all required suitable space somewhere in the cramped post-coach. The conveyance finally set off, and the nervous tension that had been mounting in the three passengers over the last few hours, due to the uncertainty of their journey's progress, vanished in an instant. The post-coach bumped along over the cobblestones paving the Imperial Road, and soon left the city's boundaries. The prefect of the Saar Departement had suggested extending the existing road link between Paris and Saarbrücken to Mainz as early as 1798. However, the construction of the Grande Route Impériale had still not commenced in the year 1800. The three travelers were not bothered by the fact that the post-coach lurched heavily now and then, and the coach wheels clattered noisily over the rough country roads. They were completely engrossed in a most pleasant conversation throughout the entire journey. Samuel Hahnemann chatted away with Cécile Vestry in absolutely perfect French. The doctor, who was conversant in 7 foreign languages, had especially enjoyed speaking French since his youth, and inspired by the thirst for knowledge on the part of his young travel companion, who proved to be an extremely adept listener and learner, he positively blossomed. "How is it that you speak such cultivated French, monsieur? One could think you were a native-born Frenchman." "Oh no, mademoiselle. I come from the electorate of Saxony. There one speaks a cultivated Saxon at best." Samuel Hahnemann could not suppress a charming smile. Then he added, "But of course, mademoiselle, I appreciate such a compliment very much." "Oh, I love the soft pronunciation of the Saxons, monsieur. Most of the Germans' dialects sound somewhat harsh to our corseted ears. How shall I say it? By comparison, Saxon Germans sound very pleasant, and somehow possess elegance." "If you like, we could also converse in Latin, English, Greek, Hebrew, or even Arabic, of course." Cécile Vestry giggled girlishly, then replied, "Oh no, then it would be preferable to keep speaking your mother tongue." "Has mademoiselle already been to my native region?" "Yes, monsieur. It is a very pleasant memory from my childhood. My father, the dancer Auguste Vestry, once had a guest engagement at the Dresden Opera House many years ago. I was permitted to accompany him on his journey to the Electorate of Saxony. It was a grand success." "Ah, that is presumably why I know your name, mademoiselle. What a coincidence." "What, you know my father's name, monsieur?" "Oh yes, mademoiselle. Who does not know it? I myself had the great fortune of being able to admire your esteemed father's unmatched artistry in person at the Dresden Opera House about 15 years ago." Cécile Vestry could scarcely believe in such a coincidence. "He would surely be very happy to hear that, monsieur. Then, purely theoretically speaking, we could actually have already met back then? Isn't that peculiar? But presumably you would not have taken notice of me as a little girl." Now it was Samuel Hahnemann who could not refrain from chuckling. "Oh, you know, mademoiselle," Hahnemann answered in a contemplative manner, "the world is sometimes no larger than a village, and we humans run around thoughtlessly without even noticing one another properly at all. Yesterday someone was still a child, and today—" Lost in thought, Samuel Hahnemann's last sentence trailed off as he briefly glanced out of the coach window to take in their surroundings. Apart from a few surveyors who were working at the side of the road, and a French army patrol marching at a brisk military pace that had crossed a few minutes earlier, there had been nothing notable at all to see. Therefore, there was no reason to fear an ambush by a band of robbers. Hahnemann leaned back in his seat, feeling reassured. Suddenly, Cécile asked a completely unexpected question. "Are you married, monsieur?" The chambermaid pricked up her ears, but pretended to have absolutely no interest in the conversation between the two travelers. She looked out of the window self-consciously while incessantly stuffing one hazelnut after another into her mouth, which she then clamped between her molars in order to liberate them from their shells with a smart rap of her hand against her chin. All in all, it was not a very appealing sight. Samuel Hahnemann was also somewhat taken aback by the dancer's unexpected query, but hid his surprise. "Yes, I am very happily married, mademoiselle, and going on 18 years already." "Oh, I am not married, monsieur. I think that marriage would be like a chain around the legs of a dancer." Samuel smiled at the unvarnished artlessness of his young travel companion. "The sooner you marry, the better, mademoiselle. Body and spirit are by nature meant for marriage." "Does that theory correspond to the general accepted scientific opinion, monsieur, or does it stem more from your own experience?" "Both," Samuel Hahnemann replied without a moment's hesitation. "I'm speaking to you as an experienced husband, as well as in my capacity as a doctor of medicine, chemist, a scientist, and even as a practitioner of the art of healing." Cécile Vestris gave a slight, somewhat self-conscious little cough. "Ahem. Has mademoiselle caught a little cold?" "No, I don't think so. You just mentioned it and called yourself a practitioner of the healing arts. We are then colleagues as a consequence, if you will, monsieur. My art takes place on the stage, yours inside the human body. Both arts are intended for the well-being of humankind." Hahnemann considered for a moment before finding the right words. "If a physician recognizes the obstacles to a recovery, mademoiselle, and he knows how to eliminate them so that the restoration of health endures, then he understands how to act both practically and thoroughly, and is therefore a genuine healing artist. And if an aficionado of the arts understands how to take in the lovely, graceful movements of a dancer in accompaniment to exquisite music, then this, as in his perception thereof, will certainly contribute no less to his physical as well as spiritual well-being. So you are not completely wrong. We are indeed both artists, each one in his own fashion." The corpulent chambermaid appeared to be suffering from a type of motion sickness, so that the coach had to make frequent stops on open stretches of road to allow Madame to relieve herself outside. After another such interruption in the journey, the chambermaid did then finally intrude on the conversation, as it was clear that her health problem was weighing in on her too much to do otherwise. "Cher Monsieur Docteur," she began somewhat hesitantly at first, "is there an effective remedy against—" She stopped for a moment as her face turned deathly pale. "Against motion sickness?" "But certainly, madame." Dr. Hahnemann quickly opened his medicine kit, rummaged around in it, and then pulled something out. "Here, this would be something for your problem, madame. These cocculus drops could indeed help you, on condition that you do not eat hazelnuts in such copious quantities anymore." "Formidable!" cried the chambermaid with delight, and took the tincture bottle from him with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. Shortly after having taken a few drops, her condition improved quite dramatically, and her rosy coloring also returned. As she thanked him for his medical assistance, Samuel Hahnemann said only one sentence. "In order to cure illnesses gently, quickly, thoroughly, and completely, select a medicine that can evoke a similar affliction as the illness it is intended to heal." "Are you one of these traveling miracle doctors, Monsieur Hahnemann?" "Of course not, Mademoiselle Vestris. Regrettably, I can no longer believe in miracles. Oh, if I could but explain to you how wonderfully simple homeopathy is at its core." "You could simply try to do that, Monsieur Docteur. Explain it to us. The journey ahead is still long, and there are always good reasons to learn something new. Do you think so too?" Even the hefty chambermaid nodded in agreement. "Well then, I will try to explain it in very simple words. So, to start with, similia similibus curentur. Behind this fundamental principle is the underlying realization that medications are not necessarily curative in and of themselves. No, they act like a poison and interfere with the functions of a healthy organism. In short, they make a healthy person sick. Every medicinal substance induces an artificial illness with its own specific complaints. What a very precise, medically trained observer notices about such drug-induced illnesses is only that they are strikingly similar to the natural medical condition of humans. But similia similibus curentur also means like cures like. Is that correct, Monsieur Docteur? Exactly right, mademoiselle. The changes that the medicines cause in a healthy body do not exist for no reason, so they would have to mean something. I always wondered about this matter until one day, seemingly by accident, I came across a clue to the concealed language of drugs. Perhaps the changes and sensations that every medication elicits in a healthy human organism are the only perceivable sounds that they can express to an impartial observer. The chambermaid's scream sliced through the coach's interior. She had broken one of her molars while cracking open another hazelnut with brute force. Now she was holding her tooth between her fat, stubby fingers, her face distorted with pain. Cécile Vestris threw an exasperated look in her direction, but the chambermaid continued wailing. Samuel Hahnemann tried to end the unpleasant situation as quickly as possible. First he looked into his medicine kit and quickly selected an effective remedy, namely Arnica montana, which he proceeded to administer to the chambermaid for her toothache. You see, madame, a miracle doctor or quack would have used a very questionable concoction from a therapeutic dirt pharmacy in this situation. I, on the other hand, make use of the incalculable riches in nature herself. A practitioner of the healing arts in this sense is directly linked to the Godhead, the world's creator. After this last sentence, calm returned to the inside of the coach, and Samuel Hahnemann leaned back in his seat with satisfaction. The coach soon reached the next relay station in Ida-Oberstein, where the travelers had a restful break and fresh horses were hitched to the coach. By now they had already covered a significant portion of their journey to Mainz, and the time had passed quite quickly due to their lively conversations. Shortly after starting on the next leg, the sky darkened. Thick black clouds gathered above the treetops of the Hunsrück mountain range, and in no time at all, the first bolts of lightning flashed across the sky, followed by deafening thunderclaps. The black cloud formations opened above them to release a mighty deluge of rain that pounded on the roof of the postcoach, rendering any further conversation impossible. The road ran directly along the banks of the Nahe River. The small river rose from its bed very rapidly and threatened to flood the road in some places. Despite great effort, the coachman was just barely able to keep the horses under control, and so he brought them to a halt at a fork in the road. The next safe place would be a village called Kiln. He wanted to seek suitable accommodation there. The travelers had seen some freestanding quartzite rocks towering up to 30 meters high on that stretch of road. They jutted out over the treetops and presented an eerie sight with each flash of lightning. Suddenly the coach halted yet again, and the coachman could be heard addressing a stranger who was standing at the side of the road, and who apparently was the reason the conveyance had stopped. "Hey-ho, huntsman, you have come along at just the right time. Is this the way to Kiln?" The stranger replied, "We appear to have the same destination. Kiln lies in that direction, and over there is the way to Zobernheim. I'll guide you." Hahnemann could just barely make out the vague contours of a man through the rain-spattered window of the coach door. Even though the service regulations strictly forbade the coachman from picking up strangers on the road, the precarious weather conditions and his human compassion won him over, so he asked his passengers for permission to allow the soaked huntsman to sit on the coach driver's box beside him. Naturally, none of the three travelers had any objection, as they were sitting snugly inside the dry coach. The hunter swung himself up onto the driver's box. The coachman started the horses moving with the customary "giddy up" and cracked his whip in the air. The dangerous drive continued its course. Even though the coach was only moving along at a snail's pace, the coachman nevertheless appeared to have become lost. Hahnemann could make out mounds of dirt from some dug-up ditches, a muddy meadow, and then the coach unexpectedly turned into a sunken lane and rumbled a few more meters into a wood. All at once, a musket shot rang out. The horses shied, the huntsman jumped from the driver's box, and the coachman shouted something unintelligible. Then one of the coach wheels hit a tree trunk, and the entire transport tipped over. Heavens above, how pitch dark it was! What a confusion of legs, arms, faces! This was Samuel Hahnemann's first encounter with an unusual type of socializing, for the heavy-set chambermaid, who weighed several hundredweights, was suddenly on top of him, and the beautiful French dancer was clutching fearfully at his left arm. Then everything stopped moving. After everyone had sorted out their limbs again, the occupants all crawled out of the belly of the overturned coach through the window, one after another, like chimney sweeps from chimney. Surrounding them was a pitch-black forest, incessant rain, and dirt on the ground. Once they had managed to pick themselves up with some effort, they found that by some miracle none of them had been seriously hurt. Then the young huntsman suddenly stepped forward, aiming a musket at them. And more thieving vermin were lurking behind the next rock outcropping, so that any thought of escape was hopeless. The coachman, who had had a rough landing in a thicket and was just freeing himself from it, was the first to grasp the situation. Full of dismay, he cried out, "Hell's bells and damnation! Shinda Hannes is here!" Then his knees began to shake. Meanwhile, the alleged huntsman had approached Samuel Hahnemann and demanded, "Hand over your money, or you are a dead man." But the doctor was quick-witted enough not to show himself the least bit impressed by the bandit's crude threats. Like an English gentleman, he stood in front of Cécile Vestris and the chambermaid, rummaged in his pockets to extract a handful of kreuzers, and tossed the pocket change disdainfully at the bandit's feet. But the outlaw merely stepped over them and placed the musket muzzle directly on his victim's chest. In the meantime, the other highwaymen were busying themselves with unhitching the coach horses. Now it was the valiant coachman who wanted to stop them. The third bandit was calming the two frightened horses when Cécile Vestris noticed that the person was not a man at all, but a female robber. It was indeed a young woman dressed in the garb of a male bandit. She was quite an unusual sight. Of course, Samuel Hahnemann was in no position to prevent the robbers from ransacking the entire coach. They looted some not insignificant sums of money from the ticket collector's knapsack: 3 louis d'or, 1 gold Caroline coin, 11 guilders, a few Kronenthaler, silver francs, kreuzer, 7 six-batzen coins, and a guilder in silver and a ducat in gold. All in all, a rather princely sum. However, the band of outlaws were by no means satisfied with their loot. They now started ransacking the travelers' bags. They were particularly interested in luxury items like coffee, tobacco, sugar, cotton wares, clothes, fabrics, wine, watches, and jewelry. They stole anything that could somehow be turned into money. Samuel Hahnemann's travel bags did not yield anything useful, and they also had no use for his medical kit, nor for the 2 trunks that only contained literature about the field of medicine. However, Mademoiselle Vestris's bags seemed to catch their interest, as they were filled to the brim with valuable stage costumes. The female robber in men's attire, who was affectionately called Jules by the bandit leader, helped herself generously to the contents of Mademoiselle Vestris's collection of costumes. She was especially taken with some side hoops, which were elaborately embroidered and decorated with beads. But then the group's leader discovered a box that contained the dancer's written contract for the scheduled guest appearance at the theater in Mainz. The document was personally issued and sealed by the prefect of Mainz, his fiercest enemy. Now he was curious and wanted to learn about the details of Mademoiselle Vestry's guest appearance. Of course, her striking beauty and grace had not escaped the outlaw's notice. He abruptly dropped his coarse demeanor and suddenly even seemed almost gallant. Jules watched her lover's unexpected transformation from a distance with piercing, jealous looks. The bandit leader was clearly hatching a plan. Indeed, he even gave his group of bandits the order to stop all looting activity immediately, to everyone's great astonishment. He ripped the precious side hoops from Jules' arms and handed them back unscathed into the bewildered dancer's keeping. Schinder Hannes explained to the dancer in lofty tones that he hoped she would not take offense at his prank. He had only wanted to prove that he alone had the authority to command in this canton, and that at the same time it would be a great honor to invite all those present to a joyful celebration that was to take place in a nearby town on the evening of that same day. It would give him great joy and pleasure to receive the famous dancer Cécile Vestry there himself, even before his rival, the prefect, was able to. She would not be permitted to refuse his personal request, which would otherwise injure him greatly and force him to think unpleasant thoughts. The festive ball would take place in Griebelschied, the next town. There was also a cartwright there who would be able to repair the post-coach's broken wheel. However, the travelers would have to do without their horses for the time being. Then he hung his musket over his shoulder and concluded with the words, "Go now, act calm, and don't cause any trouble in the town." Then he swung himself up onto one of the stolen horses and called out to the post-coachman, "Hey, cousin, if you want a last look at your brown one, then be quick about it." In the blink of an eye, the entire band of robbers galloped after him into the dark shadows of the forest. Only Jules looked back to throw a scornful look at the beautiful dancer. Then she, too, disappeared into the nearest thicket. The ambushed travelers were now standing alone in the wood and the rain, and it was high time to make a decision. The closest post station was too far away for them to walk. As they would not be able to manage it, they had no choice but to make their way to the nearby village named Griebelschied that the robber had told them about. When they arrived at the village, they soon found the aforementioned inn where the festivities were to take place. They each took a room, and the coachman immediately made his way to the village cartwright, who had clearly already been informed about the broken wagon wheel by the robbers. As darkness fell, Samuel Hahnemann suddenly heard the clatter of horses' hooves and a jumble of voices. It carried from the front court of the inn all the way up to his room in the attic. He had just freshened up a bit and was trying to clean up his very soiled clothing as well as he could. However, the attempt seemed doomed to failure. When he looked out of the tiny window, he could see a crowd of people approaching the inn on foot and on horseback. There were many simple peasants among them, but some better-dressed, higher-born people as well, who most certainly could not be having any dealings with the band of robbers. The innkeeper had placed sentries at the entrance to the inn, who were inspecting all the arrivals before they were permitted to enter the hall. What was going to take place here? A village feast? A robber's ball? Hahnemann could find no plausible answer to this question. Then suddenly, music began to play in the hall below. In mid-August 1800, Schinder Hannes was polishing his romanticized image as a bandit king in the decaying partial ruins of the Schmidtburg. The castle had been abandoned by its owners after the French annexation in 1795 and had only been inhabited by poor day laborers and owls ever since. In a word, it was the ideal hideout for thieves and highwaymen. Now the band of outlaws was making their way to the next village from there. The festive ball at Kriebelschied by Kirn was proving to be the highlight of the period. The dear subjects from near and far turned out, including all of the mayors and officials of the handful of subjugated villages in the surrounding territory. The inhabitants of these villages of Schneppenbach, Hahnenbach, Bundenbach, and Bruchied were considered to be in the know, as was called in outlaws' jargon, meaning they posed no risk to the bandits. Almost all of the young people from the neighboring localities had flocked to the inn's ballroom. The dance floor was already the scene of high-spirited goings-on. The innkeeper had procured an especially generous supply of food and drink so that the guests could be served as best as possible. Several music ensembles were playing their music. Drunken farmers, vagabonds, and beggars were all professing friendship and celebrating brotherhood with one another. The mayors and officials from the surrounding localities, however, were carousing at a separate table. When the doctor and Cécile Vestris entered the hall rather timidly, the local dignitaries invited the two strangers to take a seat at their table. Presiding over the celebration was Johannes Bückler, also known as Schinder Hannes. The Bandit King had dressed himself in especially elegant finery. He wore a gray coat, a red vest, brand-new leather breeches, and a tricorn on his head, which sported a long hawk feather. Dressed in his special apparel, which had been especially made for him by his personal tailor, from stolen fabric and leather naturally for the occasion, he was visibly enjoying the spectacle immensely. Samuel Hahnemann also recognized a few other of the accomplices at his side, who had merely hours before taken part in ambushing the post-coach. There was one who was merely named Musket Michael by his cronies. They called another Black Peter. His swarthy face could have served a painter as the ideal model for a grotesque devil's mask. A third bandit was called Carl the Squinter, simply because he had a squinting eye. But the evening's main attraction was the woman at the bandit leader's side, his betrothed Juliane Blasius, called Jules. She had exchanged her masculine robber's attire for a very elegant ball gown, which elicited a great deal of admiration from all those present. Jules went to great effort to observe precisely who her fiancé was keeping company with, but in particular she kept a close eye on the French dancer. The reason was that at these festivities, Schinder Hannes was being lionized by the girls from the area as a popular dance partner, which is why she kept pulling him onto the dance floor herself so that no other female could lure her betrothed away from her. But the girls also took to the floor with the other outlaws in a most familiar fashion, and the young lads proposed endless toasts to Schinder Hannes. Now that was a real man's man, the rogue who refused to dance to the tune of the French piper. Everyone in the room went to great lengths to make room for Hannes and his Jules, which was conferring a great honor on the attractive bandit couple. At some point, Samuel Hahnemann noticed that the outlaw king was favoring his right leg, not only while he was dancing, but all the time, as though it were causing him severe pain. But then, after a while, Hannes came over to their table and asked Cécile Vestris for the next dance. Cécile was frightened out of her wits. When she realized that she would not be harmed, she soon reconciled herself to her fate. She ended up being carried away by the celebratory mood of the evening, so that she was even persuaded to perform a sample of her dancing artistry when Schinder Hannes requested it. It was a very odd sight to see the French ballerina presenting a quadrille naturaliste on the village dance floor with the bandit leader as her partner, and both of them completely surrounded by simple folk. It was a free, improvised dance, an acrobatic, ecstatic twisting of the extremities. It was a wild and exuberant, fiery and perspiration-inducing performance. Led by Hannes, she then moved gracefully through the crowd of gawking spectators before starting a solo dance at the center of a circle, finally ending it with the splits. That was followed by a deft flick of her foot, and Schinderhannes's hat, with the attached hawk feather, spun through the smoke-filled air in a high arc. Now the mood in the hall had reached the boiling point. The crowd ran riot and enthusiastically demanded an encore, but Schinderhannes guided his partner back to her seat and thanked her courteously for the masterful performance. Jules, however, left the festivities feeling offended and was not seen again for the rest of the evening. Hannes did not seem especially concerned by her disappearance, for now he even seated himself between the doctor, Cécile Vestris, and the local dignitaries, and searched for a suitable topic of conversation. While doing so, he touched his right leg time and again, which was obviously causing him considerable pain. Samuel Hahnemann inquired as to whether he might be of assistance in his capacity as a physician. But Hannes only dismissed the query and said, "A few weeks ago I fell from a tree while harvesting cherries, and am still not yet able to walk properly." Samuel Hahnemann would not let himself be rebuffed. With a few expert touches, he palpitated the robber's knee joint until he at last cried out in pain. "Very well, then," the robber said sheepishly. "What can I do about it? Please help me, doctor." Samuel Hahnemann pulled a small jar containing a salve from his vest pocket and advised the bandit to apply the contents to the painful spot without delay. That would provide quick relief from the pain. Hannes accepted the salve and promised to follow the doctor's advice. He rummaged around in his leather breeches pocket as he was inclined to pay the doctor a fee for coming to his aid with the administered medicine, but Hahnemann adamantly refused to accept the money. Perhaps somewhat emboldened himself by the festivities, he made it clear to his patient that he occasionally treated aristocrats and robbers alike for no fee, which, by the by, Schinderhannes acknowledged with a good-natured twinkle in his eye. "No harm meant, doctor, but I'll be returning the favor." With these words, the cheerful bandit rose from the table and started hobnobbing with the common folk once more. The splendor of the setting had also served to inflate his assessment of his abilities. At the neighboring table he loudly boasted, "Were there as many of us as there are Frenchmen, I would accomplish heroic deeds that would in no way be inferior to theirs." The jovial crowd boisterously showed their approval of his brazen claims. Yes, the scene was dominated by a general atmosphere of considerable familiarity between the outlaws and all the people in the room, and Schinderhannes paid the tabs for nearly everyone who stopped by his table. The bandit king could be almost charming, or at least show plenty of humor in his dealings with strangers. Above all, he possessed a talent for accommodating himself to his respective conversation partner, which not only young women found very appealing. Even Cécile Vestris had become somewhat taken with this young man as the evening wore on. The festivities continued well into the wee hours, and Schinderhannes had danced with almost all of the young girls several times in a row. Every time he took his leave from his dance partner, he always ended with the identical question, "Do you even know who you have been dancing with all night long?" With Schinderhannes. However, this fact did not appear to terrify the young women at all, but just the opposite. It encouraged them to twirl their skirts and legs with even more enthusiasm than before. Samuel Hahnemann and Cécile Vestris finally ventured onto the dance floor themselves, and when they did, they could scarcely believe their eyes. At the other end of the hall, they spied the coachman, who had looked thoroughly dejected only a few hours earlier, but was now capering across the dance floor with wild abandon, the chambermaid in his arms. Having caroused mightily all night long, the bandits finally retired to the ruins of the Schmidtburg, and the rest of the crowd straggled home to their beds soon afterwards. Samuel Hahnemann awoke very late the next morning. He felt a piercing pain in his temples as he was not at all accustomed to such nocturnal excesses. The sun was already high in the sky, and it was long past time to leave. As he glanced out of the window of his little room, he spied the repaired post-coach standing outside in the courtyard. He rubbed his eyes as he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Even the 2 draft horses were back at their customary places, in full harness, at the front of the carriage, while the coachman was just in the process of feeding them their oats. Just at that moment, a mounted horseman arrived, who then swung jauntily out of the saddle, but then entered the inn's courtyard with a slight limp. Of course, it was Schinderhannes. Shortly thereafter, he was standing inside Samuel Hahnemann's attic room, politely asking after the state of his health. "You did me a great turn yesterday, and I have come to thank you for it." Hannes was pointing at his knee while talking. The doctor exhorted him to go easy on his knee joint and apply the salve twice daily without fail. Then he would be free of pain again in a few days. But the robber merely smiled wanly and said, "I fear that no remedy will help this illness any more." He suddenly stood up and peered out of the tiny chamber window with a troubled look, as if he feared to see a bailiff who had followed him, but there was no unfamiliar figure to be seen. Nevertheless, he suddenly seemed very downcast. "Is it really true, doctor, what people always say, that the blood of an executed man is an infallible remedy against the falling sickness?" Dr. Hahnemann was dumbfounded. He had not expected to hear a question like that. The cheerful bandit leader from the previous evening had become a pensive man overnight. He advised Schinderhannes not to give such nonsense a second thought. It was pure superstition. "You must know, I heard the bird of death calling me last night. I haven't given it at all much thought, but sometimes things happen much faster than you think they will." Samuel Hahnemann didn't know what to reply this time either, but it appeared that his visitor had not expected an answer from him, for the bandit king was already showing signs of making a hasty departure. He only wished to pay his respects to Mademoiselle quickly, he said in bidding farewell. Then he shook the doctor's hand warmly and left the room. Schinderhannes, in fact, gave the lovely Cecile a gold necklace as a present, which, he assured her, had been acquired honestly. The gift was intended as a remuneration for her artistic performance, and, in addition, as a small compensation for the inconvenience that he, after all, had caused. As he bade the beautiful dancer farewell, he did then ask a small favor of her. Would she be kind enough to convey his very personal regards to the Mainz prefect and report extensively on the previous day's robber ball? Shortly thereafter, this unusual bandit king galloped out of the courtyard and quickly disappeared into the protective shadows of the dense forest. The forest provides the bandits with protection and provisions, too, for nature does not judge. When she gives her gifts, who is good or who is bad, that decision is man's alone. Hahnemann was contemplating thus as they resumed their interrupted journey to Mainz. Cecile Vestry and the doctor had made themselves comfortable inside the post-coach, for the chambermaid had absolutely insisted on sitting in front on the driver's box next to the coachman. Of course, she received the enthusiastic consent of her 2 travel companions. What ought to be mentioned here, perhaps, is the fact that the coachman also carried a parting gift from the bandit leader on his person. It was a letter of safe conduct, issued and signed with the name John Through the Forest, which guaranteed the owner of the letter safe passage on all the roads of the Sohnwald and Hunsrück region. However, the coachman was clever enough to keep the gift concealed from the sight of anyone who was not meant to see it. The journey to Mainz continued without any notable incidents, and in general, the drive progressed in comparative silence, as Cecile Vestris and Samuel Hahnemann both felt the need to recover from the strain of the previous days and nights, and they compensated for the lost sleep of the night before until they were approaching their final destination. Several hours must have passed by the time the coachman brought his horses to a stop with the customary "Woha" command, and they found themselves in front of the Hôtel de Paris in Mainz. The beautiful French dancer took her leave from her gracious travel companion and thanked him warmly for his bravery and assistance. Samuel Hahnemann merely played it all down. He had only been doing his duty, and it was not worth mentioning at all. Cecile Vestris invited him to her approaching dance matinee at the Mainz Theatre. It would give her great pleasure and be an honor if he could come to the performance. Of course, Samuel Hahnemann was absolutely delighted to accept and gladly promised his attendance. However, he still had a few urgent matters to take care of, which would most surely require skill and tact and could not be put off any longer. So the two of them parted company on a hot day in August, and they would in fact not meet again until one day before her dance presentation. Samuel Hahnemann first looked up his colleague Dr. Jakob Fidelis Ackermann. Ackermann had been entrusted with heading the École Supérieure in Mainz and promoted to their primary professor. He was currently working on experiments with electricity in his private laboratory, which he was convinced was very promising for the future of a range of sciences. But when Samuel Hahnemann brought up his request for support in seeking the release of his unjustly apprehended friend Karl Georg Friedrich, who had surely been locked up by the French in Saarbrücken erroneously and now urgently needed outside assistance, Professor Ackermann instantly became very quiet and cautious, as if jolted by an invisible electric shock. He took Hahnemann to one side and made it completely clear that in these difficult times it would be impossible for one to risk starting a quarrel with the French authorities for a trifling incident, as he expressed it, to say nothing of precipitating an outright falling out. No. Unfortunately, that was an impossible request to fulfill. Hahnemann should instead attempt to present his plea to the new prefect himself, but he was also not in a position to help him gain an audience with him either. He regretted it very deeply, but he simply had to understand, etc., etc. Jakob Fidelis Ackermann not only dressed himself up to look like Napoleon, but also his hairstyle and his overall outer appearance were precisely synchronized with that of the emperor himself. Samuel Hahnemann therefore decided to forego bringing up his own professional concerns and left the professor's private laboratory in a most melancholy mood. How could he have been so mistaken in his judgment of a fellow human being and valued colleague? The city of Mainz had the appearance of one endless construction site. Everywhere buildings were being torn down, while at the same time new objects were being built on all of the important streets and squares. Napoleon not only wanted to rebuild the city as a fortress, but also to expand and renovate it as a display for his empire. Entire streets were therefore being refashioned into ostentatious boulevards. The French occupation itself had also been accompanied by militarization. 10,000 to 12,000 soldiers were a constant presence and had to be billeted somewhere amongst the 20,000 citizens. As a result, Samuel Hahnemann had a great deal of difficulty finding suitable accommodations. After he had found a tiny and far too costly little room in the Bleichenviertel, which was actually only large enough to hold his bags, he resolved to go pay his next courtesy visit. The chemist and physician Nikolaus Karl Molitor was a professor of chemistry, pharmaceuticals, and pharmacology. After Mainz University was dissolved, he was named professor of chemistry at the Provisional School of Medicine. He enjoyed the highest esteem as both a teacher and a doctor, and he was generally a man known to embrace progress in all the sciences. Therefore, Samuel Hahnemann was full of hope as he was led through the professor's house by one of the servants. He was very cordially received in the scientist's study, and Nicolas Carl Molitor was, as it soon turned out, a very interested reader of all of Hahnemann's writings. After the two men had spent some time theorizing and exchanging opinions on the latest new medical insights, the conversation, which up to that moment had been very pleasant, suffered a serious setback when Hahnemann tried to enlist his colleague's help for his friend's cause. Professor Molitor, too, saw no grounds for offering any assistance, for after all he could not possibly vouch for a colleague he had never even met in person. And besides, it was a problem that could only be resolved through the directorial government of the Département de la Sarre in any event. Even his personal relationship with the new prefect of the Département Donnersberg could not offer the smallest hope of success. He rattled off a few more arguments, but then suggested to Hahnemann that he should call on him again in a couple of days. Perhaps something suitable would have occurred to him by then. But Samuel Hahnemann did not want to and could not wait that long. He needed help immediately and urgently, or at least some good advice, also from a financial perspective, because his travel funds were slowly melting away. Samuel Hahnemann firmly resolved to seek out the two brothers and renowned professors, Joseph and Karl Wenzel, the very next day. If, however, these gentlemen were also unable to help him further, there was only one possibility left to him: to abandon his journey out of necessity and to travel back to Mölln without having accomplished anything. In his despair, he had nearly forgotten the actual purpose of his visit to Mainz altogether, and wandered almost aimlessly through the torn-up streets of the city, when suddenly a four-wheeled calèche with a turned-down cover clattered by so closely to him that it missed hitting him by only a hair. A bolt of ice-cold fear shot through him. He stood as if rooted to the spot, and appeared to be completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing in the middle of the Große Bleiche, a busy, important thoroughfare, without even noticing where he was. But then he heard a familiar voice. "Dr. Hahnemann, mon Dieu, I hope you haven't been hurt." A beautiful young woman jumped out of the calèche, which had stopped a few meters away, and came toward him, waving excitedly. Gradually he gathered his wits about him again. A hackney coachman, who had been prevented from continuing on his route by the incident, scolded and cursed at the pedestrian, who was still standing in the middle of the boulevard. Then Cécile Vestry quickly grabbed his arm and led him to the nearest safe sidewalk, then began to hug him fiercely. "Mon Dieu, you scared me half out of my wits. You could have come under the wheels, Monsieur Hahnemann." The doctor was thoroughly astonished to meet Mademoiselle Vestry again, and sought her pardon for the unfortunate mishap and his carelessness. Finally he began to tell her of his fruitless efforts in regard to seeking the release of his friend, the unpleasant visits to his colleagues, and their cold-hearted rejections. And Cécile listened to him attentively all the while. "You simply must come to the theater for my matinee dance performance tomorrow. All the important people from Mainz will be there, and even the prefect has announced his attendance. Just imagine that, Monsieur Docteur. What an honor for an unimportant little dancer." All of a sudden, Samuel Hahnemann understood what she was actually trying to tell him. "You say that the prefect has announced his personal attendance?" Cécile Vestry made a movement suggesting a bow. "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet himself in person. He even wishes to make my acquaintance. What do you say about that? Isn't that marvelous?" It was indeed marvelous. It was even more than that. It was wonderful. Samuel Hahnemann jumped for joy and hugged the dancer impetuously. "You must absolutely be there tomorrow, Doctor." Of course he would be there. At that moment he couldn't think of anything he wished for more. "Tell me, mademoiselle, Do you think it might even be possible for you to introduce me to the esteemed Monsieur Préfet? Cécile merely gave him a charming smile. If it means so much to you, monsieur, I could introduce you as my impresario. That should not prove to be a major difficulty among artists, isn't that so? The next morning, Samuel Hahnemann was picked up by a calèche and taken directly to Theatre Square. He had put on his finest clothes and was looking forward to the upcoming cultural event. How many years had it been since he had last visited a theatre performance? He could not even remember exactly when it had been. Cécile Vestris absolutely shone on the stage with her interpretation of a gavotte dance from the comic opera Panurge dans l'île de Lanterne, the same dance that had secured her father's reputation as a living dance legend 15 years earlier. It was a rousing success, and the Mainz audience was almost literally lying at the young dancer's feet after her performance. She could have wished for nearly anything just then, and no one could have possibly refused to grant her those wishes at that moment. The city's dignitaries and citizens stamped their feet wildly and demanded an encore. Flowers were raining down from the theater's ceiling, and the dancer was invited to the separate theater box where the government inspectors and prefects were seated. Samuel Hahnemann had just received a previously arranged signal from Cécile, and he was now hurrying out of the auditorium and up the stairs to the theater's gallery, where the entrance to the prefect's strictly guarded box was. None of the soldiers dared to block the path of the celebrated dancer and her male companion. To the contrary, the door opened instantly, and the French government inspector gallantly kissed the performer's delicate hand. Charming compliments spilled out of him, as they only can from practiced civil servants. Then Samuel Hahnemann was introduced to the prefect himself, who then expressed his deepest respect. Yes, even in faraway Paris he had already heard of his innovative medical healing arts. Samuel Hahnemann could scarcely believe his ears. The morning celebration extended into the late afternoon, and Samuel Hahnemann met a number of other important personalities and officials in the process. Thus, but not completely by coincidence, he also met a highly ranked justice assessor of the Département Donnersberg, who in turn was a good friend of the deputy prefect of the Département de la Sarre. Hahnemann plucked up his courage and asked the assessor for his most gracious assistance in the cause of his incarcerated friend. The high-ranked official had guaranteed every citizen equality before the law and a public trial. So he made note of the name Dr. Karl Georg Friedrich and promised to help Hahnemann's friend, provided that he indeed not committed any offenses. Samuel Hahnemann was an extremely happy man that day, and the rapturously acclaimed Cécile Vestris also had reason to be very happy. He had no idea how to thank her. "Then invite me to a good dinner, Monsieur Docteur." Exactly. Their triumphs had to be celebrated fittingly, and so they were soon sitting in a restaurant directly on the bank of the Rhine, remaining there until night fell, somewhat in their cups, and happily reminiscing all the while about their joint adventure with the notorious bandit king, Schinder Hannes. A few weeks later, Hahnemann returned to his family in Mölln, safe and sound. On his desk he found a stack of letters, including another reply from an older colleague who was also a friend. It contained an offer to take over a small, flourishing doctor's practice in a small provincial town very close to Leipzig. When he told his wife Henriette, whose pregnancy was at an advanced stage, she merely said, "Our travels have now taken us all over the country, Samuel. Back in our native Saxony, we could begin our life's journey together all over again. Let's go there." A few weeks later, on October 1st, 1800, the Hahnemann family's 9th child was born. The baby girl was christened Louise. One of the godparents, incidentally, was Karl Georg Friedrich, the friend who had been released from prison by a French court shortly beforehand, as the accusations against him had turned out to be an orchestrated plot to discredit him. By the summer of the following year, 1801, the Hahnemanns were living in Machen, near Leipzig. Although Samuel once again owned a small house there and could not complain about a lack of patients, he still felt the need to move on to Eilenburg on the Mulde River later that summer, where he and his family then stayed for the next 2 years. In the winter of 1803, which had come early, Hahnemann read a report in a Leipzig newspaper by chance that immediately caught his undivided attention. It was a detailed article concerning the capture, the subsequent trial, and ultimately the execution of Schinderhannes, the notorious robber. The bandit was finally apprehended because the pressure on both the French authorities on the left side of the Rhine as well as the German authorities on the right side of the river had been building since 1801. In particular, it was the special criminal court established by the Mainz prefect Jambon Saint-André in early April of 1802 that quickly had some initial successes against the robber band. Finally, they forced Schinderhannes to flee to the allegedly safe area on the right side of the Rhine. However, he was captured there with his mistress, Julia Blasius, at the end of May and handed over to the French judiciary in Mainz by the German authorities in June 1802. So it ended as it had to. Schinderhannes was rightfully sentenced to death in accordance with the law that prescribed capital punishment for armed burglary and ambushes. A guillotine was erected in front of the city gates for the execution. On November 21st, the condemned criminals were transported to the public place of execution in 5 open carts. Schinderhannes was the first to be led before the executioner. Upon ascending the scaffold, he gazed at the blade for a few moments and then said quite calmly, "I die willingly. I deserve death. But among these," he pointed at the other 19 cronies present, "at least 10 of them will die innocent." A few seconds later, his execution was carried out, and after a mere 24 minutes, all 20 coffins were filled. Samuel Hahnemann could not bring himself to finish reading the report, and so, lost in thought, he put the paper aside. The young robber's fate moved him profoundly, and a cold chill ran down his spine when he thought back on the events that occurred during his unforgettable journey in the year 1800. What had happened over the last 3 years? Day-to-day living had long taken over his life again. He was constantly advancing his medical knowledge. He contemplated writing his main oeuvre soon. His financial situation had not improved significantly in the past few years. Which unexpected twists of fate would the future hold for him and his family? Suddenly, the beautiful French dancer came to mind. What had likely become of Cécile Vestris? He would have liked to have known in that instant. Soon the Hahnemanns had moved on again, to Wittenberg, to Torgau, and then to Dessau. Restlessness was apparently as much a part of the doctor's being as was the never-ending drive to explore science. He and his family would move house and location many more times during the subsequent years of his life. During this time, Hahnemann kept working on developing his theory and the practical applications of homeopathy until it became a self-contained, consistent and balanced therapy. In the year 1810, he finally published his magnum opus, The Organon of the Healing Art, which became the foundation of the worldwide renown that Samuel Hahnemann and homeopathy would come to enjoy. Before the end of his ever-restless but long life, he would even move to Paris. There he would finally receive the fame and honors he had earned for his life's work as the father of homeopathy. But he never encountered the beautiful dancer Cécile Vestris again before his death in 1843.
Dear listeners, we hope that you enjoyed this audio journey. The story is pure fiction and never happened as told here, but the protagonists are very real. Johannes Bückler, better known as the Bandit King Schinderhannes, and Christian Friedrich Samuel Hahnemann. Johannes Bückler lived from 1779 to 1803 and caused considerable trouble with his gang, particularly in the Kirn area, which is in the Nahe River Valley, not far from where the Hevert headquarters are located today. Samuel Hahnemann lived and worked in no fewer than 15 different localities between 1792 and 1804. He seldom stayed in the same place longer than a few months before he felt the urge to move on, always searching restlessly for new knowledge and ways to earn a living. However, there was also a more profound reason for these occasionally even precarious changes in location. His mind and entire way of thinking were in a state of intense upheaval during those years. He was extremely dissatisfied with the conventional medical science that he had studied and practiced up to that time. Instead, he was on the trail of a completely innovative medical concept, and so his inner turmoil drove him onward in the hope of discovering new medical knowledge. We will never know whether or not Samuel Hahnemann could have turned the Bandit King Schinderhannes and the French dancer Cécilia Vestris into dedicated homeopathy buffs. One thing is certain though, with his homeopathy, his life's work, Hahnemann left a timeless legacy behind for all of us to benefit from. On that note, I'll end with my best wishes. Sincerely yours, Matthias Hevert.